The moment the judge read the final line of the document, my son-in-law's arrogant smirk vanished. He looked at my daughter, then at me, and his face went pale as he finally understood. The house I bought for them, the one he was so proud of, was never truly his to keep. He thought I was just a foolish old woman, easily pushed aside. After all, he did it in front of everyone at my daughter's wedding, when he moved me out of the front row like I was a stranger just to make room for his boss. He thought my only purpose was to write checks and stay quiet, but he forgot what I did for 40 years before I retired. And in my hand, I held the one-page contract he had signed without a second thought. That signature was the beginning of his end. This is the story of how I took back my dignity, my money, and my house. Before I tell you exactly how I did it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It gives me strength to see how far this story of justice can travel. The day of my daughter Sarah's wedding felt like a dream I had been waiting my whole life to come true. The air in the old historic ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and roses, the very ones I had insisted on because they were Sarah's favorite. A string quartet I had hired was playing softly in the corner, their music weaving through the gentle hum of the guests finding their seats. Everything was perfect. It was exactly the picture I had held in my mind for years, a perfect day for my only child. I had dipped deep into my savings to make it happen. When Sarah had come to me, her eyes shining but her face laced with worry about the cost, I had waved it all away. "You only get married once, sweetheart," I told her. "It should be everything you want." And so, I wrote the check for the venue. A beautiful Gilded Age mansion with floor-to-ceiling windows. I paid for the catering, the flowers, the music. I wanted to give her a foundation of beauty and joy as she started her new life. With Mark. Even then, there was a part of me that felt a quiet unease about him. He was a successful car salesman, handsome and charming in a way that always felt like a performance. He could compliment you and make you feel like the most important person in the room, but his eyes never seemed to smile with the rest of his face. Sarah was head over heels for him, though, and I told myself that was all that mattered. I was a mother. My job was to support my daughter, not to judge the man she loved. I took my seat in the front row, right on the aisle, my heart swelling with pride. I smoothed down my dress, a deep blue silk that had cost a little too much, but I felt it was worth it. This was my day too, in a way. It was the culmination of years of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and 1,000 tiny sacrifices. I had raised a good woman, and now I was watching her step into her future. I felt a tear prick the corner of my eye and smiled. The music swelled, signaling the ceremony was about to begin. The guests quieted down. This was it. But just as the officiant was taking his place, I saw Mark walking down the aisle toward me. He wasn't smiling. He leaned down, his voice a low whisper that only I could hear, but his presence was a spectacle for everyone in the first few rows. "Eleanor," he began, his smile as tight and artificial as a plastic doll's. "So glad you're here. Listen, a couple of my very important business partners just arrived. The Hendersons. They flew all the way from Cleveland. I need to make a good impression. Would you be a dear and move back a couple of rows? I need this seat for them." I stared at him, certain I had misheard. "Move?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "But I'm the mother of the bride." His smile didn't waver. "I know, and we so appreciate everything you've done. This is just business. You understand." He gestured with his head to an empty chair in the third row, tucked behind a rather large man in a gray suit. I looked for my daughter. Sarah was standing off to the side, waiting for her cue to walk down the aisle. She saw the whole exchange. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw a flicker of panic in her face, a silent plea for me to just go along with it, to not make a scene. Then, she looked away, busying herself by adjusting her veil. She wasn't going to say a word. She was leaving me to be swept aside by the man she was about to marry. The humiliation was a physical thing. It felt like a hot flash, a wave of heat that washed over my face and chest. My hands trembled in my lap. To be dismissed so casually, so publicly, at my own daughter's wedding. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't a business partner. I was family. I was her mother. But Sarah's pleading eyes were burned into my mind. Don't make a scene. So I didn't. With as much dignity as I could muster, I stood up. I felt the curious, pitying eyes of our friends and relatives on me as I shuffled past them, murmuring apologies. I found the seat in the third row and sat down, my back ramrod straight. From there, I watched as a well-dressed couple I'd never seen before took my place in the front row. Mark shook their hands warmly before taking his spot at the altar. The ceremony was a blur. I heard the words, I saw the exchange of rings, but it all felt like I was watching it on a television screen. The beautiful flowers I had paid for now seemed to mock me. The music from the string quartet sounded like a funeral. Dirge. All I could feel was the sting of disrespect, a cold, hard knot forming in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just a thoughtless gesture. This was a statement. Mark was showing me, on the very first day of their marriage, exactly where I stood. I was not a priority. I was an obstacle, an old piece of furniture to be moved when something more important came along. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, a shower of rice and cheers erupting around them, Mark's eyes met mine. He wasn't smiling at me with joy. It was a look of quiet, confident victory. In that gut-wrenching moment, I knew this wasn't the end of the humiliation. It was only the beginning. The months that followed the wedding were a study in forced smiles and quiet compromises. I told myself the incident in the front row was a product of Mark's wedding day jitters, a clumsy attempt to impress his colleagues. For Sarah's sake, I wanted to believe it. I wanted to build a bridge, not a wall. So, when they moved into the beautiful two-story colonial that my $50,000 gift had made possible, I showed up with a housewarming present and a heart full of hope. The house was lovely, with big, bright rooms and a sprawling backyard, but my hope quickly began to curdle into a familiar sense of unease. My financial contribution wasn't seen as a gift to be appreciated, but as an investment they were entitled to manage. A few weeks after they moved in, I was over for dinner when Mark spread a glossy brochure for a landscaping company across the dining table. "We're thinking of putting in a stone patio and a fire pit," he announced, circling a design that I knew would cost at least $10,000. "It'll be great for entertaining. Your friends from the book club would love it, Eleanor." I smiled weakly. "It's beautiful, Mark. How are you planning to budget for it?" He looked up from the brochure, his expression one of mild surprise, as if I'd asked a rude question. "Well, that's where you come in," he said, his tone casual. "We figured you'd want to chip in, to finish the place off properly. It increases the property value for all of us." For all of us. The words hung in the air. I had given them the down payment, a gift with no strings attached, but in his mind, he had already laid claim to my future earnings as well. I tried to set a gentle boundary. "Mark, I was happy to help with the house, but my savings need to last me through retirement. A patio is a luxury, not a necessity." Sarah, who had been quiet until then, immediately jumped in, her voice taking on a pleading, wounded tone. "Mom, please, don't be like this. All our friends have nice backyards. We just want a place we can be proud of. I thought you'd be happy for us." It was their classic maneuver. Mark made the unreasonable demand, and Sarah framed my hesitation as a personal attack on their happiness. I felt the familiar pressure to give in, to write the check just to make the uncomfortable moment go away. I ended up agreeing to pay for a small portion of it, but the conversation left a bitter taste in my mouth. It was clear my role was not mother, but financier. The dismissals grew bolder. One Saturday afternoon, I drove over to drop off some mail that had been sent to my house by mistake. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw two men in work clothes loading a pile of mangled greenery into a truck. My heart stopped. They were my roses. The beautiful, climbing roses that had grown alongside my old house for 20 years. The ones my late husband and I had planted together. I had spent a whole weekend carefully digging them up and transplanting them to Sarah's new backyard, a piece of her father's memory for her to keep. I rushed out of the car. "What's going on? What are you doing?" Mark came out of the back door, wiping his hands on a rag. "Oh, hey, Eleanor. Just clearing out these old thorny things. They were blocking the sun. We're pouring a concrete slab here for a hot tub. I stared at the empty space where my roses had been, my throat closing up. You didn't tell me. It was a spur-of-the-moment thing, he said with a shrug. The hot tub was on sale. You know how it is. He didn't know how it was. He didn't know that every petal on those bushes was a memory. He hadn't just removed some plants. He had paved over a piece of my history without a second thought. When Sarah came out, she saw the look on my face and rushed over. "Mom, I'm so sorry. We were going to tell you. It all just happened so fast." But her apology was as empty as the spot in the garden. She had let him do it. The final straw came a month later. They were hosting a barbecue, and I was determined to be cheerful. I brought my signature dish, a 7-layer salad that took hours to prepare. As I placed it on the buffet table, Mark came up behind me with a group of his friends. He clapped me on the shoulder and said, loud enough, for everyone to hear, "Ah, here it is, the famous salad from the 1970s. Eat up, guys, before it puts you into a coma." A few of his friends snickered. I forced a smile, my cheeks burning. It was just a joke, a harmless little dig. But it wasn't. It was part of the pattern. The joke was always on me. I was the old-fashioned mother, the out-of-touch woman with the boring food and the endless checkbook. I was a caricature he had created for his own amusement. I stayed for another hour, making polite conversation, but my heart wasn't in it. I watched Sarah laugh at Mark's jokes, completely oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the constant casual cruelty he directed at me. Driving home that night, the string of small cuts and public slights finally felt like a deep, infected wound. I had been telling myself this was just Mark's way, that I had to be patient for Sarah's sake. But I was starting to realize that my patience wasn't creating peace. It was simply giving them permission to see how far they could push, how much they could take, before I finally broke. I just didn't realize how soon that moment was coming, or that it would be them, not me, who would make the final, fatal mistake. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October when they asked me to water their plants. They were going away for a long weekend, a little getaway to a lakefront cabin. Just to recharge, Sarah had said. I didn't ask who was paying for it. I didn't want to know. I just agreed. Like I always did. The dutiful mother, the ever-present safety net. Their house was silent when I let myself in. The air was still, and dust motes danced in the afternoon sun slanting through the big windows. I walked through the rooms, a ghost in my own daughter's life. I saw the expensive new television mounted on the wall and the stone patio visible through the glass doors, a permanent monument to my own weakness. In the backyard, a large, ugly plastic cover sat where my roses used to be, hiding the hot tub they had bought with money they didn't have. Each object was a fresh prick of resentment. I filled the watering can in the kitchen sink, the silence pressing in on me, and that's when I saw it. Lying on the granite countertop, plugged into the wall, was Mark's phone. He must have forgotten it in his rush to leave. As I stared at it, the screen lit up. A notification appeared. It was a messaging app, a name I recognized from the barbecue, Rick, one of the men who had laughed at my expense. Below his name was a small microphone icon indicating an audio message. My first instinct was to look away. It was a private conversation. It was none of my business. I had been raised to believe that you respect people's privacy, even when they don't respect you. I turned my back to the phone and walked into the living room, watering the large fern by the window, but my mind was racing. The memory of every slight, every casual dismissal, every time I felt used and invisible, swirled in my head. My hand was shaking so much that water sloshed onto the hardwood floor. What could he be saying? Why did I have this cold, dreadful feeling that it was about me? I walked back into the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself I was being foolish, paranoid, but I had to know. I had to know if the unease I felt was real or just a product of my own lonely imagination. With a trembling finger, I unlocked the phone. Mark had carelessly used their anniversary as the passcode and navigated to the message. I pressed play. Rick's voice came through the small speaker, tinny and loud in the quiet house. "Hey man, just checking in. Did you manage to squeeze any more cash out of the old lady for the boat? Or is she finally tapped out?" He chuckled. Then I heard Mark's voice, and the sound of it made the hair on my arms stand up. He was laughing. A deep, hearty laugh, full of genuine amusement. "Nah, not yet," Mark said. "But I'm playing the long game. You're not going to believe the setup. So when she gave us the 50 grand for the down payment, the bank made her sign a gift letter, right? Standard procedure. Basically, a document saying the money is a gift, not a loan, so the bank knows we're not secretly in debt." He paused, and I could hear the sound of a drink being poured. But the old paralegal in her couldn't resist. She made us sign this other little piece of paper, this stupid promissory note between us, saying it was a personal loan, that she'd forgive over time. It's basically worthless, but it made her feel smart. Rick grunted. "So what's the plan?" "The plan," Mark said, his voice dripping with condescending pride, "is that my lawyer drew up a one-page gift tax acknowledgement and release. It looks super official. All it does is get her to legally state once and for all that the money was a gift, which makes our little side agreement null and void. Once she signs that, the house is 100% clear, and I can pull a home equity loan against it for the boat. And the best part? What's that?" "She'll sign it," Mark said with another laugh. "Sarah will bring it to her next week. She'll say it's just a final paper for the bank's records. She just has to turn on the waterworks a little, you know. Oh, Mom, it would help us out so much. And Eleanor will sign anything to make her little girl happy. She's so desperate for a happy family. She's completely clueless." The audio message ended. I stood there, phone in hand, the silence rushing back in, heavier and more suffocating than before. Clueless. He thought I was clueless. Desperate. He thought I was desperate. He had laid out his entire plan, a neat little roadmap of his greed and my daughter's betrayal. Sarah wasn't just a bystander. She was the weapon he was going to use against me. Her tears were a tool to get my signature. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the phone against the wall. A strange and terrible calm washed over me. The pain was so sharp, so absolute, that it went beyond tears. It was a state of pure, cold clarity. Every excuse I had ever made for them, every benefit of the doubt I had given, evaporated in an instant. This wasn't a series of misunderstandings. This was a calculated, long-term campaign of emotional and financial exploitation. In the deafening silence of my daughter's home, the sound I heard was not my heart breaking. It was the sound of a heavy iron door slamming shut, deep inside of me. Part of me that had made excuses, that had hoped for the best, died in that moment. And in its place, something cold, quiet, and meticulously precise began to wake up. I don't remember finishing the watering. I don't remember locking their front door. The drive home was a complete blur, a sequence of traffic lights and street signs that my body navigated on autopilot while my mind was trapped in that silent kitchen, listening to Mark's voice on a loop. Clueless, desperate, she'll sign anything. The words were acid, dissolving the world I thought I lived in, the family I thought I had. When I stepped into my own house, the familiar quiet felt different. It was no longer peaceful. It was hollow. The grandfather clock in the hall, a wedding gift from my own parents, ticked with a steady, indifferent rhythm. I placed my keys in the ceramic bowl on the entryway table, the clinking sound unnaturally loud. I took off my coat and hung it in the closet. Each mundane action was a desperate attempt to pretend that my world had not just been shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. I walked into the living room and sank into my worn armchair, the one my husband always used to sit in. My gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, crowded with framed photographs that traced the timeline of my life. My eyes landed on one in particular. It was a picture of Sarah, aged 7. She was missing her 2 front teeth and grinning a huge, gappy smile, her arms wrapped around my neck in a fierce hug. We were at the county fair, and I had just won her a giant stuffed bear that was bigger than she was. I remembered the feel of her small, sticky hands, the sound of her joyful shriek when the man handed her the prize. I remembered looking down at her and feeling a surge of love so powerful it felt like my heart would burst. That was the moment the pain finally broke through the numbness. A dry, ragged sob escaped my throat. It wasn't about the money. It was about that little girl. Where did she go? When did she become a stranger who would use her mother's love as a weapon? The betrayal was a physical ache, a crushing weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. I grieved for my daughter, the one I had raised, the one who had apparently vanished, replaced by this cold accomplice to her husband's greed. I grieved for the years I had spent sacrificing, believing I was building a legacy of love, only to find out I had been building the foundation for my own prison. I let myself cry then, silent tears tracking down my cheeks in the fading afternoon light. I cried for my foolishness, for my willful ignorance, for every time I had bitten my tongue and made an excuse just to keep the peace. But as the shadows in the room grew longer, something began to shift inside me. The tears slowed, and the heaving in my chest subsided. The fiery, agonizing pain began to cool, hardening into something else. Something heavy, solid, and cold. It was resolve. The grief was still. There, a permanent scar on my heart. But beneath it, the paralegal I had been for 40 years began to stir. She was the woman who had organized chaotic case files, who had found loopholes in poorly written contracts, who understood that feelings were irrelevant in the face of facts. And the facts were simple. I was being systematically defrauded by my own family. Mark's voice echoed in my head one last time. The old paralegal in her couldn't resist. She made us sign this other little piece of paper, this stupid promissory note. It's basically worthless. A slow, cold smile touched my lips for the first time that day. Worthless? He had no idea. He had laughed at the one thing that could undo him. He had underestimated me. They both had. They saw me as a mother, a widow, an old woman. They had forgotten who I was. My tears were gone now. My hands, which had been trembling, were perfectly still. I stood up from the armchair, my movements no longer robotic, but deliberate. I walked to the old oak desk in the corner of the room, the one I had used for decades to review documents and balance accounts. I unlocked the bottom drawer with a small silver key I wore on a chain around my neck. Inside, everything was in perfect order. Folders, organized alphabetically, insurance papers, my will, and one thick blue folder with a neatly typed label on the front. It read, Sarah and Mark, House Loan Agreement. I pulled the folder from the drawer and placed it on the desk. The tears had stopped. The shaking in my hands had subsided, replaced by a steady, familiar purpose. They had mistaken my love for weakness and my generosity for stupidity. They thought they knew this story and how it would end, but they had only read the first chapter. I was about to write the rest. Under the warm glow of my desk lamp, I opened the blue folder. The scent of old paper and ink filled the air, a fragrance that felt more comforting to me than any perfume. For 40 years, this was my world. Facts, figures, and the carefully chosen words that could build fortunes or dismantle them. My hands were steady as I laid out the contents across the polished wood of my desk. It was all there, preserved in perfect chronological order. There were 2 key documents. The first was a copy of the gift letter the bank had required. It was a simple, standard form, stating that the $50,000 I provided was a bona fide gift and that I held no lien or claim against the property. This was the document Mark was counting on. It was the reason he felt so secure, so smug. In his world of fast talk and surface-level deals, this was the end of the story. But then I picked up the second document. It was typed on my old Underwood typewriter, the letters slightly uneven, giving it a weight and seriousness that a modern printout could never have. The title at the top was Personal Promissory Note and Agreement of Familial Faith. This was my stupid little piece of paper. Marky and Sarah had signed it at my kitchen table, barely glancing at the text, eager to get the cashier's check from my hands. I ran my finger over the key paragraph, the one my legal instincts had compelled me to write. I read the words softly to myself. The sum of $50,000 is provided as a personal loan, the repayment of which is forgiven at a rate of 10% for each calendar year that a positive and good faith familial relationship is maintained by the borrowers, Sarah and Mark Peterson. The full remaining balance of the loan becomes due and payable immediately in the event that the property is sold, refinanced for equity withdrawal, or should the borrowers engage in actions that constitute a material breach of this good faith understanding, including but not limited to acts of deceit, disrespect, or financial exploitation. A material breach of good faith understanding. Mark hadn't just breached it, he had gleefully confessed to it on tape. He had laughed about his plan to deceive me, to exploit my love for my daughter for financial gain. His words were the evidence, and this document was the weapon. But I knew I couldn't act on emotion. I needed a clear head. I needed advice. I pulled out my old leather-bound address book and flipped through the pages until I found the number I was looking for. Arthur Jennings, my old boss. He was a brilliant, sharp-as-a-tack real estate lawyer who had retired a few years ago. He had taught me everything I knew about the power of a well-written clause. I dialed his number, my heart beating a little faster. "Arthur? It's Eleanor Vance," I said when he answered. "Eleanor." His voice was warm, filled with genuine surprise. "My goodness, it's been too long. How are you? Still keeping the world organized, I hope?" "I'm trying, Arthur," I said, a small smile touching my lips. "Listen, I'm sorry to bother you at home, but I have a situation. I need a legal opinion. Not as a client, just as an old friend." I spent the next 10 minutes laying out the entire story, from the humiliation at the wedding to the audio message I had discovered that afternoon. I read him the key clause from the promissory note. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, I feared he would tell me I was being foolish, that the document wouldn't hold up. Then, I heard him let out a low whistle. "Eleanor, you magnificent woman," he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "That's not a promissory note, that's a work of art. A good faith clause is notoriously hard to enforce, but he solved that problem for you. A recorded confession of his intent to deceive you? That's not just a breach, that's a prosecutor's dream. You have him, hook, line, and sinker." Relief washed over me. So potent it almost made my knees weak. So what do I do? You don't call them. You don't confront them. You let the paper do the talking, Arthur instructed, his voice shifting into the familiar, professional tone I remembered so well. "First things first, secure that audio file. Email it to yourself. Save it on a thumb drive. Make 2 copies. Evidence is everything. Then, you're going to draft a formal demand letter. Cite the breach of the agreement. State that the full $50,000 is now due, and give them 30 days to pay. Send it via certified mail. Let's see how smug he is when he has to sign for it." After we hung up, I felt a surge of energy I hadn't felt in years. I was no longer a grieving mother. I was a paralegal with a case to build. I followed Arthur's instructions to the letter. I transferred the audio file from Mark's phone to my computer, saved it to a brand new thumb drive, and then emailed the file to myself with the subject line, "Evidence, Peterson Loan." Then I deleted the message from Mark's phone and cleared the history. No need for him to know how I found out. Let him wonder. Finally, I sat down at my dining room table. I didn't use my old typewriter. I used my laptop. I wanted the letter to be cold, clean, and brutally professional. I cited the agreement, quoted the clause, and detailed the breach, stating that I had irrefutable evidence of their intent to commit fraud. I demanded payment in full within 30 days, or I would be forced to pursue all available legal remedies, including placing a lien against their property. By the time the sun had set, my dining table looked less like a home and more like a command center. The letter was printed. The evidence was secure. And the first shot in this quiet war was sealed in a crisp, white envelope. Sarah was supposed to visit me next week with a deceptive document for me to sign. Instead, the mailman was about to deliver a formal declaration that their game was over. They just didn't know it yet. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. For the first time in months, I didn't feel a heavy dread in the pit of my stomach. The grief was still there, a quiet, humming, background noise, but it was no longer the dominant sound. In its place was a profound and liberating sense of purpose. I made my coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and looked at the crisp white envelope I had prepared the night before. It felt solid, real, a tangible consequence. There was no hesitation. After I finished my toast, I put on my coat, walked to my car, and drove to the main post office downtown. Not the small local branch, but the large, imposing federal building. It felt appropriate. This was official business. I stood in line, holding the letter. It was a simple thing, just a few sheets of paper in an envelope, but it felt as heavy as a lawsuit. When my turn came, I stepped up to the counter and addressed the clerk with a clarity that felt foreign and new. "I need to send this via certified mail," I said, my voice even, with a return receipt requested. The clerk, a bored-looking woman with tired eyes, nodded and began stamping the envelope with a series of green and white forms. As I watched her, I knew this was the point of no return. Once this letter left my hand, the quiet, painful peace of our family would be shattered forever. A small part of me, the mother in me, flinched at that thought. But the woman who had been humiliated and deceived knew that there was no peace to shatter. There was only a carefully constructed lie, and that lie had to be torn down. I paid the fee, took my receipt, and walked out of the post office into the bright morning sun, feeling lighter than I had in years. The next few days were a strange limbo. I went about my routine. I tended to my small garden. I went to my book club. I paid my bills. But underneath it all, there was a quiet, thrumming anticipation. I was waiting for the echo of the stone I had just thrown into their placid, selfish little pond. I felt a strange pang of sadness for Sarah. I knew this would hurt her, that she would feel caught in the middle. But I also knew that she had chosen her side long ago. She had chosen it in the front row of her own wedding. She had chosen it every time she defended Mark's cruelty. She had chosen to be his partner, and partners share in the consequences. 3 days after I mailed the letter, it arrived. Not in my mailbox, but in theirs. I knew because on the 4th day, my own mail contained a small, flimsy green postcard. It was the return receipt. It had the date, the address of delivery, and a frantic, illegible scrawl in the signature box that I recognized immediately as Mark's. I held the small green card in my hand, studying it. Proof of delivery. Proof that the message had been received. In my 40 years as a paralegal, I had seen hundreds of these cards. They always signified the beginning of something. A lawsuit, a foreclosure, an eviction. They were the starting pistol for a legal battle. And now, I had just fired one myself. I didn't have to be there to know what that moment was like in their house. I could picture it. Perfectly. Mark, coming in from work, annoyed at having to sign for a letter from the mailman. He would have ripped it open carelessly, expecting a piece of junk mail or a bill. I could see the confusion on his face as he read the first few lines, the legal letterhead with my name and address at the top. Then his eyes would scan the paragraphs, the words, promissory note, breach of contract, and immediate repayment, jumping out at him. The casual arrogance would melt away, replaced by a flash of disbelief, then a surge of hot, explosive rage. He would have sworn, thrown the letter onto the granite countertop he was so proud of. He would have felt cornered, outsmarted. The clueless old woman had just checkmated him. And Sarah, I could see her, drawn by the shouting. She would pick up the letter, her hands trembling. She would read it, and her first reaction would be panic, then tears. The very tears she was supposed to use on me next week to get my signature. The irony was so bitter. It almost made me laugh. She would be terrified, not because I was wrong, but because she knew, deep down, that I was right. She had seen the promissory note. She had signed it. She just never believed I would have the courage to enforce it. The green card in my hand was more than a receipt. It was a declaration of my own independence. I knew what was coming next. As if on cue, My phone, sitting on the kitchen table, began to buzz. Sarah's face, smiling from a picture taken in happier times, lit up the screen. My first instinct, born of years of habit, was to answer immediately, to soothe her, to fix it. But the new, colder, clearer part of me took over. I watched the phone buzz, the vibrations rattling against the wood. I let it go to voicemail. The days of me answering to their every whim, of jumping at their every command, were over. From now on, they would learn to wait. After a few minutes of silence, the phone buzzed again, indicating Sarah had left a voicemail. I let another minute pass, a quiet moment to steel myself before I opened the message. My daughter's voice filled the room, thick with manufactured panic and real tears. "Mom? Mom? Pick up the phone. I just saw your letter. What is this? A joke? This has to be a joke. How could you do this to us? We can't pay this. We'll lose the house. Mark is going crazy. You're destroying our lives, Mom. After everything we've been through, you have to call me back right now and fix this." I listened to the message twice. The Eleanor of a few weeks ago would have been gutted. She would have been overwhelmed with guilt, her hand already reaching for the phone to call back and surrender. But the woman listening now heard something different. I heard the coached desperation in her voice, the carefully chosen words designed to trigger my maternal guilt. "You're destroying our lives." It wasn't an appeal. It was an accusation. It was emotional blackmail, pure and simple. I deleted the message. Over the go. Next 48 hours, my phone became a weapon they tried to use against me. The calls were relentless, a constant buzzing assault. When I didn't answer, the text messages started. Sarah's were pleading. "Mom, please, we can talk about this. Don't shut me out. You're breaking my heart." When her approach failed, Mark took over. His messages were a spray of digital bullets, each one meant to wound. "You think you're so smart with your little letter? My lawyer will shred it. And you." A few hours later. "Enjoy your lonely life in that sad little house. You're a bitter old woman trying to ruin your daughter's happiness because you have nothing else. And the one that evening, the one that proved my case more than any other. You will regret this. I promise you." I read every single message. I did not feel fear. I felt a grim sense of validation. With each hateful word he typed, he was strengthening my position. He was providing a written record of his character, a perfect illustration of the bad faith my contract had described. I took screenshots of every message and saved them to the evidence file on my computer. He thought he was intimidating me. In reality, he was just handing me more ammunition. My silence was my shield. It was a wall they had never encountered before. They were used to me engaging, explaining, justifying, and eventually, conceding. My refusal to play the game was driving them into a frenzy. They had lost control of the narrative, and they had lost control of me. I knew it would come to a head. Their digital attacks weren't working, so they would have to escalate. The inevitable happened on Thursday evening. It was dark, and a cold rain was starting to fall. I was in my living room, reading a book, when the headlights of a car swept across my front window. Mark's oversized SUV pulled into my driveway, parking at an aggressive angle. The doorbell rang, not a polite chime, but a long, insistent press. I didn't move. It rang again, and then a third time. Then came the banging. Not with a fist, but with an open palm, a flat, percussive sound meant to intimidate. "Eleanor, I know you're in there. Open this door." It was Mark's voice, muffled but clear, vibrating with rage. I looked through the peephole. He was standing on my porch, soaked from the rain, his face red and contorted. Sarah was behind him, huddled under the small overhang, looking pale and terrified. She wasn't a willing participant in this. She was a passenger in his rage. But she was there. She had come. A tremor of fear, cold and sharp, finally shot through me. He was bigger than me, stronger. But the fear was quickly replaced by that same cold resolve that had been my constant companion for days. This was my house, my sanctuary. He did not get to intimidate me here. For 40 years I had dealt with angry men in legal disputes, men who blustered and threatened when the facts were not on their side. Mark was no different. He was just a bully who had finally met a boundary he couldn't cross. The banging on the door grew louder, more frantic. They expected me to be hiding, to be cowering. They expected the emotional, accommodating mother they thought they knew. I took one last, deep breath, walked to the door, and turned the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. As I pulled the door open, I held my head high, my expression as calm and unreadable as a judge's. They had come looking for an emotional battle. I was about to give them a lesson in the cold, hard facts of contract law. I opened the door and stood in the doorway, my hand resting calmly on the knob. I did not invite them in. The cold, damp air swirled around my feet, but I didn't feel it. I met Mark's furious gaze with a placid stillness that seemed to infuriate him even more. "Finally!" he barked, taking a step forward, trying to use his height to intimidate me. I didn't move back. "What is the meaning of this letter, Eleanor? Are you out of your mind? You can't just demand $50,000. That money was a gift." "No, Mark," I said, my voice quiet but carrying clearly over the sound of the rain. "It was a loan. You have a signed document that says so." "That piece of paper is a joke," he spat, his voice rising. "We're family. You're supposed to be helping us, not trying to make us homeless." I let the accusation hang in the air for a moment before I replied. "I did help you. I gave you the foundation for a new life together. It was you who decided to treat me like a bank, and then a doormat." Sarah pushed past him then, her face a mess of tears and rain. "Mom, please," she sobbed, reaching for my arm. I gently but firmly pulled it back, out of her reach. "Let's just go inside and talk about this. We can work it out. Please don't do this to us. You're tearing our family apart." The words were meant to be a knife in my heart, and a month ago they would have been, but I had already mourned the family she was talking about. What was left was a business transaction. "The time for talking is over, Sarah," I said, my voice softening just a fraction, but losing none of its resolve. "You had many opportunities to talk to me. You could have talked to me when your husband moved me from the front row of your wedding. You could have talked to me when he tore out my roses. You chose not to. You made your choice." My refusal to engage, to argue, to cry, left them sputtering. They had come expecting a screaming match, an emotional drama they knew how to win. They were completely unprepared for this calm, immovable woman standing before them. Mark, seeing his anger had no effect, switched tactics to legal threats. "I've spoken to a lawyer, Eleanor. He said that contract is worthless. A ridiculous familial faith clause? No judge in the country will enforce that. You have no proof of anything. This is just harassment." He had walked right into it. He had given me the perfect opening. I looked at him, my expression unchanging, and delivered the final fatal blow. "No proof?" I asked, my voice still quiet. "Is that what you were planning to tell the judge? Were you also going to tell him about the audio message you left for your friend Rick? The one where you laughed about your plan to get me to sign a release form so you could buy your boat?" The effect was instantaneous. The angry red color drained from Mark's face, replaced by a sickly pale white. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked utterly and completely stunned. I wasn't finished. I turned my gaze to my daughter, whose sobs had hitched in her throat. "And I suppose you were going to deny your part in it, Sarah? The part where Mark said all you had to do was turn on the waterworks because your mother is so clueless and desperate that she'll sign anything you put in front of her." Sarah let out a small, strangled gasp, her eyes wide with horror and shame. She finally understood. I knew everything. The silence on the porch was absolute, broken only by the drumming of the rain. They were exposed, their ugly little conspiracy laid bare, not by a lawyer in a courtroom, but by their victim on her own front porch. The power had shifted, completely and irrevocably. I looked back at Mark, at the bully who was now speechless, defeated. "The letter gives you 30 days to pay the $50,000. I suggest you listen to your lawyer and get your finances in order. Now, if you'll excuse me, you're letting the rain in." And with that, I stepped back, and calmly, deliberately, closed the door in their faces. I didn't slam it. The quiet click of the lock was more definitive than any explosion. I leaned my back against the solid wood of the door, listening as their footsteps, clumsy and hurried, scrambled off my porch and back to their car. The storm was outside now, where it belonged. They had come for a fight, and they had lost. In the weeks that followed the confrontation on my porch, a profound silence fell. The angry calls and desperate texts stopped completely. It was as if a raging storm had suddenly blown itself out, leaving behind a quiet, unnerving stillness. I knew they hadn't simply given up. This was the silence of lawyers talking, of strategies being formed and realities being faced. The 30-day deadline in my letter was ticking away, a quiet but relentless countdown. I spent that time reconnecting with myself. I visited the local library, losing myself in the scent of old books. I had coffee with friends from my old book club, conversations that didn't revolve around my daughter's wedding or my son-in-law's latest acquisition. I was slowly, carefully reclaiming the pieces of my life that I had allowed to be overshadowed by their drama. I was Eleanor again, not just Sarah's mother. The expected call came on a crisp Monday morning, exactly 1 week before the payment was due. It wasn't from Mark or Sarah. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a smooth, professional voice introduced himself as Mr. Davies, the attorney representing my daughter and son-in-law. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his tone courteous. "I'm calling regarding the demand letter you sent my clients. We've reviewed the documentation, and while my clients dispute your characterization of the events, they are prepared to acknowledge the personal loan agreement." I stayed silent, letting him talk. I knew this tactic. Acknowledge the undeniable part. Dispute the rest. "Given the circumstances," he continued, "and in the interest of resolving this matter amicably within the family, my clients would like to propose a payment plan. An initial payment of $5,000, followed by monthly installments until the debt is settled." I held the phone, my gaze steady on the small framed photo of my late husband on the side table. Arthur had prepared me for this. "Mr. Davies," I said, my voice polite but firm as steel. "I appreciate the call. However, the agreement my son-in-law and daughter signed is quite clear. It calls for the full remaining balance to be paid immediately upon a material breach of good faith. Their actions, of which I have irrefutable proof, constituted such a breach. The terms are non-negotiable. Payment in full is due next Monday." There was a pause on the other end. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head as he realized he wasn't dealing with a confused old woman who could be easily placated. "I see," he said, his voice losing some of its smooth confidence. "I will relay your position to my clients." "Thank you," I said, and gently ended the call. A few days later, I took a different route home from the grocery store. It was a conscious choice. I needed to see it for myself. As I turned onto their street, I saw it. Staked into the manicured front lawn, just a few feet from where the hot tub still sat, was a large, brightly colored "For Sale" sign. I pulled my car over to the curb and just looked at it for a long moment. There was no surge of triumph, no feeling of victory. There was only a deep, profound wave of sadness. This was the house I had helped my daughter buy, the place I had dreamed would be filled with the laughter of my future grandchildren. Now, it was just a property, a commodity being sold to settle a debt born of greed and disrespect. This was the inevitable end of the path they had chosen. I put the car back in drive and drove away without looking back. Night before the deadline, my phone lit up with a text message. It was from Sarah. I almost deleted it without reading, but something made me open it. The message was short. "The house is sold. The closing is in 2 weeks. You'll get your money. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything." I stared at the words. The first admission of guilt I had received from her in years. "I'm sorry." 2 words, so small, yet they carried the weight of 1,000 betrayals. I felt a familiar pang in my chest, a mother's instinct to reach out, to comfort her, to say, "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. The damage was too deep, the trust too broken. An apology couldn't rebuild the house of our relationship after they had deliberately burned it to the ground. I turned off my phone. The check for $50,000 arrived by courier 2 weeks later, just as she said it would. It was a bank check, impersonal and official. I walked to my bank, deposited it, and received a small, white receipt. It wasn't a victory prize. It was a reimbursement. The cost of a painful lesson I never should have had to learn. The debt was settled. The war was over. And for the first time in a long, long time, I could finally start thinking about my own future. A future that was entirely and wonderfully my own. The first thing I did with the returned money was buy a plane ticket. It was a ticket I had dreamed of for over 30 years, the one my husband and I were always going to take, someday. I packed one large suitcase and a smaller carry-on, and for the first time, the only person I had to please was myself. I flew to Rome, then took a train to Florence, the city of art and rebirth. It felt fitting. I spent 3 weeks in a small apartment overlooking a bustling piazza. Every morning, I would wake up, make coffee, and sit on the small balcony, listening to the city come to life. I visited museums, not rushing from one masterpiece to the next, but sitting for an hour in front of a single painting that moved me. I ate pasta in tiny, family-run trattorias. I drank wine that tasted like sunshine, and I learned a few clumsy words of Italian that made the local shopkeepers smile. One afternoon, sitting in a cafe, sketching the beautiful Duomo in my notebook, a profound realization settled over me. For years, I had been afraid of being alone. I had clung to a toxic relationship with my daughter and her husband, because the thought of an empty house, of silent holidays, terrified me. But sitting there, thousands of miles from home, surrounded by strangers, I didn't feel alone. I felt free. I realized there is a vast difference between being alone and being lonely. I had been lonely when I was surrounded by family who didn't value me. Here, on my own, I was simply in my own good company. When I returned home, the house didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. It was my sanctuary, a space that was entirely mine, filled only with things that brought me joy. I rejoined my book club. I started volunteering at the local library, helping adults learn to read. I took a pottery class on Wednesdays, discovering a clumsy but deeply satisfying joy in creating something with my own hands. My life became a tapestry woven from small, happy moments, from new friendships built on mutual respect, not obligation. I never heard from Mark again. Sarah sends a Christmas card and a birthday card every year. There are no personal notes inside, just her name, signed in the neat cursive I taught her how to write. I don't know if she is happy. I don't know if she ever truly understood the damage that was done. I have forgiven her, not for her sake, but for mine. Forgiveness is the key that unlocks the door to your own prison. But forgiveness and reconciliation are two different things. Some doors, once closed, need to stay that way to protect the peace within the rooms. My life is quiet now, but it is not small. It is rich and full. I learned the hardest lesson of my life far later than I should have, but I learned it well. My peace is now my greatest wealth, and I protect it fiercely. It took me almost 70 years to learn this, but I want to tell you, so you don't have to wait so long. Your value is not determined by how much you can give to others. It's determined by the respect you demand for yourself. Never let anyone make you feel small or disposable, especially not in the name of family. True love doesn't use you. It values you. And it is never, ever too late to rewrite your own story and become the hero of your own life. Today, my peace is my greatest treasure, and sharing these stories is my greatest joy. Every subscription to this channel is a show of support that reminds women everywhere that their voice matters and their strength is real. If my story resonated with you, please help this community grow stronger. Your support helps ensure that more stories like this can be told. Thank you for listening.